Okay, thanks very much. I gave an earlier version of this presentation at a seminar series organised by James in Oxford a few months ago, and it took me about an hour to get through it, and I'm going to try now to get through it in 15 minutes. So I'm going to take you very, very quickly through the slides on this PowerPoint presentation. I apologise for the speed at which I'll be travelling this morning. Okay, so I'll be looking at the dynamics of policy making in UNHCR, in particular relationship to the issue of refugees in urban areas. And just to give you a quick summary of the presentation, I say that UNHCR plays a key role in the formulation of global refugee policy, but its policy-making processes have been subject to little analysis. And this presentation tries to fill that gap by examining the evolution of the organisation's urban refugee policy since 1997. And I must emphasise, this is from the perspective of a former UNHCR staff member who was very much involved in the events that I'll be describing in the next few minutes. So it's very much a subjective presentation, and it's an issue that would benefit from some more objective external research. Okay, firstly, a little bit of historical perspective. There's been a lot of attention given to the issue of urban refugees in the last few years, but it's by no means a new phenomenon. If you look at the literature, Pirouet in 79, Tandon in 84 did some work on urban refugees in Nairobi. Derek Cooper did some work in the early 90s on urban refugees in 1992 and pointed out that there were other regional urban refugee centres in the process of formation. So there was quite a bit of awareness during the late 70s and early 80s and early 90s that the phenomenon of urban refugees was becoming increasingly important. But there was no UNHCR policy or approach to this problem until 1997. So the question that has to be asked is, why was it in 1997 that urban refugees became a significant issue on UNHCR's policy agenda? And in the paper, I'm going to try and explain why it was at this particular moment in time that UNHCR seized upon the issue of urban refugees. And I'll be pointing out that there were a number of different aspects to this development. Firstly, there was the growing interest and awareness of urban refugee problems generated by the kind of academic literature that I've just described. But I would say that there are other and more important drivers of policy at this time. UNHCR was going through a very serious funding crisis. It was very worried about the per capita costs spent on refugees in urban areas. There was a great deal of concern within the organisation about the so-called dependency syndrome, which was allegedly demonstrated by many urban refugees. And there was a real obsession at this time about the issue of what was called irregular movers, people moving from camps to cities and refugees moving from one country to another. There was a real concern about the pull factor, that if UNHCR assisted refugees in urban areas, then more and more refugees would leave camps and travel to cities and towns as their preference. And of course at this time as well, host states, particularly in Africa, were increasingly expressing a preference for refugees to be confined to camps and not allowed to exercise freedom of movement and to move into urban areas. At the same time, a lot of questioning took place at this time within UNHCR about whether urban refugees were really refugees at all or whether they were actually economic migrants. Real refugees were perceived to be those who were content to remain in camps. Those who moved on to cities, there was some kind of doubt about their real status. And at the same time, refugees who moved to urban areas were seen to be demanding, dangerous and even violent individuals. So if you look at the 1997 policy, which was introduced in relation to these different drivers, what are the key elements of the policy? Urban refugees were seen to be predominantly young single men. They came from countries with a long history of migration, and the policy articulated the idea that only a very small proportion of urban refugees were actually legitimate. There were some people who had to go to cities for medical reasons, for education, or to be resettled, but the policy very clearly states that camps are the norm for refugees, that assistance should be denied to refugees in urban areas, that there should be extra efforts made to promote self-reliance so that refugees didn't come dependent in urban areas, that people who moved on, refugees who moved on from one country to another, should be returned to the country where they first sought asylum. And again, the 1997 policy places a great deal of emphasis on the need to strengthen UNHCR's own security procedures because of the difficult, dangerous, demanding and violent nature of urban refugees. And in the next part of the paper, I'm just going to give you a few snippets from the 1997 policy, just to give you a flavour of it. And I haven't got time to go through them all, but just to give you a couple. The policy says, life in urban areas does not constitute an answer to refugees' problems and may well be significantly more difficult. And then it says, it is often those refugees who succeed in moving from one country to another who become aggressive and violent. Giving into violent forms of protest does not pay. Now, what were the responses to the 1997 policy? Well, there was a very negative reaction by NGOs who felt that this was not a rights-based policy. And very quickly, UNHCR introduced a modified policy which removed some of the more extreme elements of the 1997 document. But NGOs continued to express concern about the nature of the policy, and so the Assistant High Commissioner at the time promised that a systematic review of the policy and its implementation would be taking place. And that's really where I came into the picture as head of the evaluation unit. I was asked to initiate an evaluation of the policy and its implementation in October 1999. But in fact, if you look at what happened, no new policy was introduced until September 2009. So in fact, there was a 10-year period of policy making. And in the paper, I'm going to look in some detail at why it took UNHCR 10 years to formulate a new urban refugee policy. And as I say here, there was a kind of policy-making standoff for an entire decade. During this period, the policy-making process on urban refugees was held back by a variety of obstacles, but also pushed forward by a number of drivers. And while the latter eventually overcame the former, it took a decade for this impasse to be resolved. So let's look at some of the obstacles and some of the drivers of urban refugee policy during this 10-year period. In terms of the obstacles to the policy-making process, I will in the paper specify a number of different issues. There was a lack of internal consensus within UNHCR. Some people were quite happy with the 1997 and modified 1999 policy. Others wanted a much more rights-based and progressive approach. There was a kind of resentment within the organisation about the pressure that the NGO community had placed on UNHCR, and there was also a kind of a negative reaction to some refugee protests that took place, most notably in New Delhi, in Cairo. And there was a sense that we shouldn't give in to the pressures that NGOs and that refugees were placing on the organisation. At this time, I would suggest there was very weak leadership within UNHCR, particularly under High Commissioner Ruud Lubbers. Despite the fact that there was this lack of internal consensus, the High Commissioner did nothing really to try and say this is going to be our new policy. And there was also a lack of accountability. UNHCR had very clearly promised in 1999 that it would look at the policy, review its implementation and come up with a new version of it. But there seemed to be no accountability to make sure that UNHCR actually implemented this promise that it had given. To the extent there was state pressure on the policy-making process, this came mainly from host countries who were quite happy with the idea of confining refugees to camps, which made it more difficult to introduce a more liberal and more progressive policy. And policy-making itself within UNHCR was a contested issue, particularly a rivalry between my own unit, which was called Evaluation and Policy Analysis, and the Department of International Protection. And I think, as James has already said, DIP, International Protection, or Gil said actually, had long had a very kind of preeminent role in the organisation and was quite resentful about the fact that there was another unit that was engaged in making policy. So a number of different obstacles to the policy-making process, but also during this decade-long period, a number of new policy drivers. The global urbanisation process, the world was becoming increasingly globalised and refugees were not an exception to this rule. Refugees increasingly had better communications, were becoming more mobile. Conditions in long-term protracted refugee situations were often becoming more and more difficult for the refugees themselves, and they began to realise that their opportunities were actually better in urban areas. The classic example being refugees moving from Dadaab, the largest refugee camp in the world, down to Nairobi in order to take advantage of the opportunities that existed in the informal labour market. Another key driver at this time was the Iraqi refugee crisis from 2003 onwards, where refugees went to countries like Syria, Jordan and Lebanon where there were no camps. It forced UNHCR to think more carefully about how it dealt with refugees in urban areas. There was a changing demographic at this time. While the policy had always been based on the idea that urban refugees were young single men, it became increasingly evident that refugees in urban areas were like refugees anywhere. They comprised a mixture of people, including women and children and elderly people and people with disabilities. I think one of the most important drivers during this period was the election of Mr. Guterres as High Commissioner in 2005-2006. And I remember very clearly in an early conversation I had with him, he said, "Jeff, there's something I don't quite understand. UNHCR is meant to be a rights-based organisation that espouses the rights set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we're colluding with governments in confining refugees to camps. It strikes me that there's something wrong with this." And it was for that reason that he actually initiated the Protection Dialogue in 2009, which specifically looked at the question of refugees in urban areas. And the formulation of a new policy was very much tied to this Protection Dialogue. In fact, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the time, Erica Feller, came to me about a month before the Protection Dialogue and said, "Jeff, this is really embarrassing. We're coming up to the Protection Dialogue on urban refugees. We've been promising a new urban refugee policy for the last 10 years and we still don't have one. Do you think you can write one in the next 2 weeks?" That was my job. So what was new about the 2009 policy? Well, this is going to sound a little bit self-serving, but my argument would be that the 2009 policy, which replaced the 1997 and 1999 policies, was much more progressive and rights-based. It talked about the need to expand protection space, to uphold freedom of movement, to address the key protection problems in urban areas, to provide urban refugees with access to livelihoods and to the labour market, to ensure that they were given secure residence rights and documentation, to make sure that urban refugees were integrated into the regular services provided to the population as a whole in urban areas, for UNHCR to establish much better outreach mechanisms to urban refugee populations, and to ensure that urban refugees enjoyed harmonious relationship with the host community in urban areas. And then another final element of the 2009 policy was the need to respect AGDM principles, in other words, age, gender and diversity mainstreaming, again making sure that UNHCR acted on the basis of mixed populations in urban areas rather than just assuming it was young single men. And what I would do in the paper, and I don't have time to do it now, is to give you a few snippets from the 2009 policy, just to give you a flavour of it. I think perhaps one of the most important statements in it: urban areas are a legitimate place for refugees to reside and to enjoy their rights. The rights of refugees and UNHCR's responsibilities towards them are not affected by their status in national legislation. That might sound fairly tame to you, but this was actually quite a radical formulation, saying that UNHCR would treat urban refugees on its own terms and not on the terms of the governments of refugee hosting states. Now, some observers, particularly Mike Kagan at the University of Nevada, have criticised UNHCR for not being sufficiently apologetic about the negative nature of the 1997 and 99 policies. But if you look at the 2009 policy, it does come up with the following statement: UNHCR has considered it essential to reconsider the organisation's position on the issue of refugees in urban areas and to adopt an approach to this matter that is more positive, constructive and proactive than has been the case in the past. That's probably the closest UNHCR has ever got to giving an apology for anything. Okay, now, bringing the story up to date, the last 5-6 years have seen a very systematic attempt on the part of UNHCR to ensure that the urban refugee policy of 2009 is effectively implemented. Again, I don't have time to go into them all, but a number of different initiatives: the establishment of an internal steering group, the establishment of a joint UNHCR NGO task team, evaluation missions to 9 countries, implementation surveys to make sure that the policy was being implemented, the establishment of a website called urbangoodpractices.org, an urban refugee learning program for UNHCR and partner staff sponsored by the US State Department, and then some technical guidelines for UNHCR staff on education, health and livelihoods programs in urban areas. So there has been, over the past 6 years, a very systematic attempt to implement this new policy. At the same time, I'm going to, in the paper, identify a number of different challenges to the implementation process. First and most importantly, perhaps, host state policy. For example, we went to Tajikistan and we found that refugees were not even allowed to live in the capital city of Dushanbe. So how can you have an urban refugee policy effectively implemented when it's directly contrary to host state policy. UNHCR's own commitment to the policy has been questioned, particularly in relation to Nairobi, where, as many of you will know, the government has basically tried to remove refugees from Nairobi and other urban areas and get them to go back to camps. UNHCR's commitment to the policy itself has been questioned. UNHCR, I would argue, has lacked the capacity and resources to implement the policy effectively. And in fact, one of the first questions that we were often asked when the policy was introduced is, what are the capacity and resource implications of this policy? How much more money will you need and how many more staff will you need? To be honest, the policy was introduced without any reference or without any investigation into those issues. I would argue that to some extent the focus on urban refugee policy was a little bit overtaken by some of the more recent crises in CAR, South Sudan and Ukraine. And UNHCR also had to adapt to the fact that urban refugees were often in emergency contexts, and particularly with the Syrian refugee crisis. When the policy was formulated in 2009, we were really thinking of much more stable situations. But now UNHCR was suddenly confronted with the need to address the needs of refugees in urban emergencies. And finally, another very important issue that has been particularly pertinent in the last 2 or 3 years has been the Syrian refugee crisis, where in general people have not been accommodated in camps. 85% of the Syrian refugees are not in camps, which obliged UNHCR to think again about what its settlement strategy was, and to introduce a new policy on alternative to camps, which actually subsumes the urban refugee policy, taking account of the fact that many of the Syrian refugees were not living in camps or in urban areas, but living in host communities, and that was a real gap in the policy that was introduced in 2009. So just a few final reflections on the policy-making process within UNHCR. Firstly, despite the size of UNHCR, despite its importance in the international refugee regime, if you look at the way it handled the urban refugee policy, there was no real clearly structured policy-making process. And I think I can say that this is not just in relation to urban refugees. I worked on a variety of different policy issues while I was in UNHCR, and there was not a clearly structured policy-making process in any of those particular areas. There were a lot of internal divisions within the organisation, some of them substantive, people just disagreeing about what the policy should be, but also, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of competitive aspect to the organisation's policy-making process, with different units and different departments trying to kind of muscle in and take a lead on the different issues. I think what is striking about the urban refugee policy as it's evolved over the years, there's been a very limited engagement of the Executive Committee and states. And to some extent that was deliberate. We didn't want to get those actors too much involved in the process. We wanted to retain control of it ourselves. Rather than ex-com and states having a major impact on the policy-making process, my argument would be that NGOs and refugees themselves actually had a much more determinate impact. And I think we've seen that happen again over the past few days and weeks with the crisis, so-called crisis in Europe, that refugees themselves have been setting the agenda, and UNHCR and other actors have been really running to kind of keep up with them. I think exactly the same thing happened with the urban refugee policy. As a policymaker myself, somebody actually writing policy, I've often said that when you write a policy for UNHCR, you often feel like there's 15 different people looking over your shoulder, making sure that they agree with what you say. And those 15 people range for everything from Human Rights Watch on one end of the spectrum to the government of Kenya on the other. And policy making is very much an attempt to try and make sure that everybody is equally pissed off in the process. You can't afford to offend anybody too much, but you can offend everybody a little bit. Coming back to the issue raised by Gil, I think a very, very important issue, the role of effective leadership. There was, as I've described, this 10-year impasse in UNHCR's efforts to formulate a new refugee policy. It wasn't really until Mr. Guterres came on the scene, took a look at what was happening and took a very decisive attitude towards the issue that that impasse was broken. Finally, probably the question I'm most often asked when I give public presentations is, what is the link between research and policy? Does research have an impact on policy? And as I've tried to suggest here, I think research did have an impact on policy because it was really academics and research that put the issue in the first place of urban refugees onto the UNHCR agenda. But my argument would be that the link between research and policy is perhaps less important and less interesting even than the relationship between policy and practice. So it's very easy for an organisation such as UNHCR to develop a policy which seems to be coherent, articulate and effective. The real challenge is to make sure that it's properly implemented in practice. Thank you.